Hello, beautiful souls, and greetings from the Center for Contemporary Mysticism in Philadelphia. My name is Joe Irwin, and it's a joy to gather with you again to explore this amazing journey that we share. We have a great program for you today, to which we've been looking forward, but first I'd like to take a moment to welcome everyone. If you're new to the Center, we hope you'll visit our website. It's simply contemporarymysticism.org, where you'll find lots of videos of past speakers and programs. You'll find groups in which you might participate, weekly or monthly sharing groups, and lots of other resources. So check that out at contemporarymysticism.org. Remember, our goal is to be a partner with you in your journey. And if you feel what we're doing is important, we invite you to get involved in the Center, join or support in whatever way you may feel called, and help us keep our programs free and open to the public. Well, now it's exciting to get to the purpose of why we're here today, and that is to talk with John Perkins. John, we're going to welcome John. He's a global economist, shaman, activist, student of indigenous cultures. He's also founder of the nonprofit Pachamama Alliance and author of books that have sold over 2 million copies. Today, John travels around the world teaching and working as social, environmental, and economic activist. So welcome, John. We'll ask John to turn on his video and be with us today. And also, as we always love to do, welcome back our own Patricia Pierce. As you know, she's not only an outstanding interviewer, but she's a former pastor, author, spiritual teacher, and leader of workshops and companion groups to support people who are in the process of being a part of the global transition taking place today. So remember, there will be a Q&A to follow for those of you who are with us live today. So make a note of your questions as we go through the interview. If you think of something you'd like to ask John, make a note. And then as we get to the Q&A time, you can click the button to raise your hand and we'll bring you on the screen and you'll be able to talk with John and dialogue on questions you may have. So we're so glad that everybody's here today, in particular John. And so, Patricia, we'll turn it over to you and John now to have a nice conversation and interview.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you, John, for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy travel schedule to be with us. And I imagine a lot of our viewers are pretty familiar with your work. However, for those who are not, first of all, your latest book is Touching the Jaguar. And as I was rereading this in recent days, I was really struck by how much has changed in terms of people's acceptance of shamanism and indigenous wisdom since you first embarked on your journey. And your introduction to shamanism came about 50 years ago when you were a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador in the Amazon, and you were at death's door. And the shaman said that he could cure you, but he was very reluctant to do so. Can you share with us what was his reluctance about?
Yes, sure, Patricia. And first, it's great to be with you and everybody who's listening. And I want to introduce you. I have an advisor here who just wants to make sure that I say everything correctly. So she's sitting here on the chair next to me.
We have our Jaguar feline energy with us today.
Yeah, her name is Jaggy. She arrived at 8 weeks old on the day Touching the Jaguar was published. So she's the real expert here.
Yeah.
The story behind that is it was 1969 and I was deep in the Amazon rainforest of Ecuador as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was dying. I was very, very sick. I couldn't keep any food down. I really couldn't even stand up. And I was a 3-day terrible journey from the nearest medical facility, a long hike through dense jungle. And then if I could find a rickety old wooden bus, a 2-day trip up into the Andes, there was no way I could do this. And so this shaman in one night healed me. And then as payment for that, and I can tell that story if you want, but as payment for that, required that I become his his apprentice. We both had a bit of reluctance around that. I didn't have any desire to be a shaman. This is 1969. Nobody had ever heard of I'd never heard of shamanism. I graduated from business school. I wanted to make a lot of money. There was no future in shamanism in those days.
Not back then.
No. In fact, what you mentioned, how things have changed. My first book came out in, I think it was 89, and it was called The Stress-Free Habit, but we went into a lot around shamanism, and bookstores didn't know what to do with it. There was no place to put it. Yeah. Today you've got shelves and that kind of stuff, New Age, shamanism. But back in 89, they didn't know what to do. So things really have changed tremendously.
And he was reluctant to heal you because it was dangerous, right? It was dangerous for him to do that.
Yeah, shamanism in the Amazon is a dangerous practice. And if a patient dies while being healed, then it's considered that probably the shaman participated in the death. So it's a very dangerous situation. And the fact that I was a gringo or white American, I was totally different here. I'm with the Jaguar people, and the Jaguar people, if you've ever seen a shrunken head or a picture of one, the Jaguar people did that because they're the only people in the world at that time and still today who shrink heads. They don't do it much today, but in those days the wars were going on. It was a fairly dangerous time, the wars in the Amazon between tribes, and so if he had failed to heal me, if I died while under his guidance, he thought there might be retribution from the American community, and in fact, there might have been. Who knows? Yeah. I mean, I've come to realize as I've traveled around the world several times, been in situations that were somewhat dangerous, that as a white male American, I had less to fear than most people, because people not only, we felt entitled, we were entitled. Often, many places, people would think twice before doing something to us that they might do to somebody else, because they were afraid of retribution. I've realized over the years that I've grown up incredibly entitled and privileged as a white male American, through no fault of my own, except that's what I was born into, and that's a sad aspect of the world, but it's there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So this healing ceremony that took place involved ayahuasca, which back then nobody had heard of. And now everybody has heard of it. But that was your experience of that, really was the starting point of this recognition of the role that perception plays in how we create our reality. So would you share with us what you experienced and discovered in that ayahuasca journey that revealed that to you?
So I had no idea what was going on. I couldn't walk, as I mentioned. A couple of very strong Jaguar men carried me into the shaman's home, which was this beautiful oval thatch roof hut. And next thing I know, the shaman comes out, and he's very scary looking. He's short, stocky, built like Tarzan, but short and stocky, old guy. And he's covered with tattoos, his body. He's naked except for a small loincloth. And on top of the tattoos now, he's got this paint, and he's looking very, very fierce. And here, the only light in the place was a fire that was down to essentially embers. So it was all these shadows, it was very scary. But I've gone beyond fear at this point, because I've accepted that I'm going to die. There's no alternative, except maybe the school teacher was the one person who could really communicate with me in Spanish, because the Jaguar don't speak Spanish, they speak Jaguar, and that was just good translation. He told me that this guy could heal me. So, what are you going to do? And suddenly somebody comes in and it doesn't look at all like the doctors I grew up with in New Hampshire. And he sits down in front of me on this stool. I'm propped up on this bench, and he's this wooden bench, and he's sitting down on the stool, and he starts, I guess you'd call it chanting, but it sounded more like growling. to me, and he's got this little cup in front of him, and he spits into it. He's singing into it and blowing into it and spitting into it, and then he hands it to me, and it says drink, and it's translated, and I drink this stuff, and it's horrible tasting, but I've had a lot of horrible tasting medicine from doctors in New Hampshire too, so that wasn't too surprising. And then after a while, I start to feel like I've got to vomit, but I haven't eaten in a week, basically. Nothing's coming up except snakes. So I'm looking down and I'm seeing all these snakes and monsters come out of my mouth, and they go down, they hit the ground, they turn into roots. And the roots then go and they turn into trees, and the jungle's all around me. And it's quite fascinating, but I'm really at this point beyond thinking, just sort of watching all this. And suddenly the translation comes through to me, touch the Jaguar. Well, I didn't realize at the time my eyes were closed as I'm seeing these things, but my eyes were closed. And I open my eyes and I look all around because it's midnight, it's late at night, dark in the Amazon, and there are jaguars around. You can hear them at night, and so I'm looking all around like, where's the jaguar? And the message comes, close your eyes and see the jaguar. So I close my eyes, and yes, this amorphous form shapeshifts into a jaguar. And I hear this voice, like my mother saying, the food and drink will kill you. Well, Patricia, the people of the Amazon eat some very strange foods, in my opinion, at that time. I grew up in New Hampshire, very conservative, nothing very interesting to eat. Meat and potatoes, basically, when I was a kid. And the Amazonian people don't drink water because they know the rivers are filled with organic matter, dead trees, dead animals. So the women make a kind of beer, and again, it's the spit thing, the spitting thing is a big part. They chew and spit the manioc plant, and that sets up a fermentation process. It's a kind of a beer, and then they can add water to it. And you have to drink a lot of it because you got to rehydrate a lot in the tropics. And strange foods like squirming white grubs live out of a rotting tree and things like this. But I hear this voice, like my mother saying, it'll kill you. And so I realize that this food, as I'm getting this message, at the same time, I see how incredibly robust and strong that the Shuar are. Men are built like Tarzan, and they live to be very old if they don't die in hunting accidents or childbirth or something like that. So during this vision quest, I come to understand that it isn't the food and drink killing me. It's very nutritious, actually. Squirming white grubs, it turns out, are quite nutritious. And so is chicha, this beer, this spit beer. It was my mindset, my perception. And the next day I was much better, and over the next few days I recovered. The shaman then came to me and said, as payment, I needed to become his apprentice. And again, 1969, I had no desire, but he'd saved my life. And one of the first things he taught me was, you have to touch the Jaguar. And I'm wearing, I can keep this Jaguar close.
You can touch it all the time now. You are touching it.
And this one over here in the chair next to me, but he said, when we confront, when there's something in front of us that's holding us back, or something that's hurting us, or something that we fear, or something that we're not able to do that we want to do, if we run from it, it'll chase us for the rest of our lives. But if we touch it, it'll give us power, and it'll change our perceptions. And when your perceptions change, your values change. And when your values change, you change your actions, and that changes your reality. And so when you think about it, Patricia, after this, I studied with shamans in Indonesia later on, and Iran and Egypt and all over Latin America, all over the Americas. And everywhere I went, I found that they have the same concept, that our reality is molded by our perceptions. Now, all these different shamanic cultures have different ways of expressing this. They have different ceremonies, different ways of expressing it, but they come from the same concept. And then when you think about it, it's the same concept that controls, that drives psychotherapy, marketing, business, politics, everything. Every part of human reality it has to be first a perception before it can become a reality. Right. And then you take the actions it becomes a reality.
Yeah. And you quote in your book, and let me just say for those who are watching this, people are getting a sense of what an incredible storyteller you are. And this book, as all your books, is just gripping. And your capacity to take us into the Amazon, into that hut, is just remarkable. And this, you quote in your book, this one of the shamans, Numi, told you, the world is as you dream it. Your people dreamed of huge factories, tall buildings, as many cars as there are raindrops in this river. Now you begin to see that your dream is a nightmare. And that really is, has driven, that understanding has driven so much of what you've been about in these last decades of your life. And as I was reflecting on your life story, John, I was really appreciating how I don't know that there would be anybody else who would have such a thorough understanding of, let's call it, imperial mind and indigenous mind, because you have immersed yourself in both of those perceptions. And after you left the Peace Corps, then you became an economic hitman. You became involved in enticing leaders in developing countries to take out loans with the World Bank and AID for big projects. And you were an economist, and you were putting forth these proposals that would convince them that this would be in the best interests of their countries. But the long-term effect of that was tremendous debt. And so you lived in that world as well. And you know how that imperial mindset plays out, or colonial mindset. As you step back and look at your life and you see these two juxtapositions, how do you, at this point in your life, view that and your involvement in the economic part of that, and how that might have prepared you to do what you're doing now?
Yeah, I think it prepared me really, really well, because after I left the Peace Corps, I did what I'd been trained to do in business school. As you said, I became an economist. I became chief economist. I ended up having about 50 people working for me, doing exactly what you described, basically exploiting countries with resources our corporations want, like oil and others. And I thought I was doing a good thing, because in business school, we're taught that when you make these large loans to these countries, and use their resources as collateral, resources that haven't yet been developed as collateral, and build these big infrastructure projects like power plants and roads, the economy of the country grows. And statistically, we can show that it does. So for many years, I thought I was doing the right thing. I was only in this business for 10 years. For at least half of them, I thought I was doing the right thing, because statistically, it looks like you are. But I came to understand that those statistics are very, very skewed in favor of the rich. So even though you may be showing GDP growth, gross domestic product, of our measure of economic growth, that really measures the wealthy. It doesn't measure what everybody else is doing. And so after 10 years, I got out, and I went back to the Amazon, to the people who saved my life. And the quote you read from Numi happened then, when I go back and I say, hey, I want to help you people save your rainforest. I know they're under threat. And his response was, well, yeah, that's great. Help us, but to help us, you've got to change the dream of your people. They've had this dream of, big industry and so forth, which you read. And so I devoted essentially most of the rest of my life to doing that, to trying to change that dream, to writing books and forming nonprofits like Dream Change and the Pachamama Alliance, and doing other things. And at the same time, I found myself, so I wrote 5 books on shamanism, and then eventually wrote the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which came out in 2004. And what I found is that, having written that book, surprisingly, and having been the chief economist, I can go out and talk to corporate executives. I get invited to huge economic conferences, like one recently in St. Petersburg, Russia, and another one in Kazakhstan. And I get to talk at the business school at Oxford and Harvard and many other places. And at the same time, I get to talk about shamanism. So it's very interesting, these two worlds. And the reason I wrote Touching the Jaguar is because it kind of brings the 5 books on shamanism and the 4 books on global economics. To me, this is the bridge, because it's, to me, that what we've done with our economic system, what economic hitmen have done, what I did was participate in creating a failed global system, an economic, social, political system that's failing us, what economists are calling a death economy, an economic system that, in order to make short-term profits, is destroying the long-term, consuming itself into extinction. But it's all based on a perception, so it's very shamanic. It's based on the perception that the sole responsibility of business is to maximize short-term profits regardless of the social and environmental costs. Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize in 1976 with that statement, among others. But his most important statement was the only responsibility of business is to maximize short-term profits, regardless of social and environmental costs. It's a perception. Mm-hmm. And it's a relatively new perception. If you look at human history, 250,000 years we've been humans. For most of our history, we've been more concerned with long-term, taking care of our kids, looking toward the future. So what I've seen is that to move out of this death economy into what we could call a life economy, we can go into that more if you want, what it is. But in order to do that, all we really have to do is change our perception from an emphasis on short-term materialistic gain, short-term materialistic profit, to long-term benefits for people and nature, all of it. So we have to make that change of perception. And once and I think it's happening incidentally. There's pushback, certainly. There's a lot of pushback, but there's a lot of people around the world that are now understanding that we must move into a green economy, conscious capitalism, the Green New Deal, B corporations. All of those things are moving us in that direction. So we're headed in that direction. And once we accept that perception, then we begin to develop value systems and actions that actually take us into this new reality of the life economy.
Yeah. And in this book, you detail the development of the Pachamama Alliance and how that came about. And I think probably a lot of our viewers have heard of the Pachamama Alliance, which is a partnership between indigenous people in Ecuador and the Amazon with people primarily initially in North America, but now it's gone global, to help preserve the rainforest and that have been encroached upon by big oil, who've been going into the Amazon to drill for oil. And you talk about in the book how for the Jaguar, who is another group in the Amazon in Ecuador, this for them was touching their Jaguar, to reach out to people in the North, people in the Western, what we call the Western world, the developed world. To reach out to us was for them the equivalent of touching their own Jaguar, touching their own fear. And yet they recognized that they needed to do this. And so they themselves took the initiative to change their own perceptions and do what needed to be done. Can you share a little bit about, I really recommend that people read the book to get all the details, but some of the really remarkable occurrences that led to the founding of the Pachamama Alliance?
Yeah, it's a long story, but the short version is that so the Jaguar, when I was living with the Shuar, the Jaguar had never been contacted by the outside world. They were enemies of the Shuar. The Shuar knew about them very well. They were at war with them often. And they speak the same language, and they have a common background, but they were still at war with each other. They were officially there were a few missionaries going in and out, so it wasn't completely uncontacted, but it was in mid-70s that they officially reached out to the world. And then, the Amazonian people went through this process. By the time I'm now spending a lot of time with the Schwa and in that area. And what's happening is that the oil companies are coming in big time. Texaco, as many people may know, it created terrible damage. There's a major lawsuit against them. And so suddenly these tribes, or what are officially nations now, understood that their perception of the other tribe, the other nation as being an enemy, wasn't really true. The real enemy was the oil companies. And so they came together, they formed federations, they touched that Jaguar. Oh, well, we've feared the Achua for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years.
Yeah.
Now we understand we got to touch that Jaguar. We need to join forces, we Schwa with the Achua and with the Quichua and with the Zapata and with all the other groups out there, the Warani and the others, in order to hold off the oil companies. And then very soon after that, they recognized that the real enemy wasn't the oil companies. It was what they told me earlier, the dream of our people that needed oil. That's what drove the oil companies, was the dream of, as you mentioned, the Western, the Northern, whatever we want to call it, the industrialized world. And so that's when they reached out to me even more strongly and said, we realize that our Jaguar is you, your people. And we also we've come to realize it's really not people. It's a concept. It's your dream. It's your dream. It's your perception. And so will you help us form a partnership with your people to change that dream? And I contacted my friend Lynn Twist and her husband Bill Twist, and the three of us ended up founding the Pachamama Alliance back in 1995. And it's dedicated to, it basically takes two courses at this point. One is to actually work within the Amazon to try to protect the area using legal means from the oil companies. And now it's mining companies, especially Chinese mining companies. And the second part is to change the dream of the modern world. So we have Changing the Dreamer programs and other programs that are done by video and many other ways that I think are in over 80 countries at this point. So it's those two prongs that we do. And of course, I'm also writing books about this. So it's quite a journey.
Yeah. And one of the really striking things about Lynn Twist's involvement was that she started seeing these faces in a journey, a shamanic journey in Guatemala. And then later on, they just kept showing up and they had paint on their faces and feathers. And she didn't know what to make of that. And she contacted you, and the Achuar had already asked you to help form this partnership. And the faces that she was seeing were those of the Achuar. Yeah. And I don't know, for us who have grown up with this colonial mindset, that in itself changes our perceptions. To know that someone can be receiving this call like that from people in the Amazon who are visiting her in her dreams, in her visions.
It's quite remarkable. In fact, if people know Lynn, she's not what you would call woo-woo.
Yeah, she's not exactly.
She's a businesswoman. She's a fundraiser, and her business is protecting the earth. But she was a high-up executive with the Hunger Project, and one of the major fundraisers. And yes, she'd been to Guatemala with me. She'd gone through this experience. I won't go into the detail. But then she's in Africa. I think it was Kenya, or Ghana, and she's sitting at this table with all these African men, and everybody's in suits, and she's in a woman's business suit, sitting at this table. This is probably 1993, I think. At the same time, I'm in the Amazon getting this request from the Achua to touch the Jaguar and form a partnership, and I'm like, I'm already overworked. I'm unsuccessful in my work with the Schwa. I can't take on anything else. But then I started thinking about Lynn. Maybe she could do it. But I thought, no, she's too busy with the Hunger Project. Meanwhile, she's in Africa sitting at this table, and she's sitting there. There's this meeting going on. As I said, people in businesses. This is a very serious meeting of Hunger Project board in that country. And suddenly she sees all the faces, and these are African faces. They're dark. And suddenly they get these orange and red and lines on these faces. And she's sitting there seeing this happen. And she can't understand what's going on, and she gets up and excuses herself, goes to the restroom and splashes water on her face and shakes herself back to reality and goes back in the room, and they're all looking normal again. And then suddenly the faces do that again.
Yeah.
She says to them, "Oh, I'm sick. I have to go home." And she gets up and excuses herself and takes the next flight back that she can take to get her home to San Francisco. And she gets back home and she's talking to people about this, including her husband, Bill, and like everybody's like sympathetic, but they don't know what's going on. And I think people are beginning to think, well, Lynn's having a nervous breakdown. She's going, what's happening to her? And she's now trying to reach me. And she's telling me back in those days, it was, how did we used to get those messages through our printers? You know, you used to get these.
Oh, yeah.
What was that called?
Fax.
Yeah, faxes, I guess.
Yes.
And leaving me phone messages. But I'm in the Amazon, and I come home and I call her, and she says, "John, nobody can understand what's going on with me, and I thought maybe you were the one person who might understand it." And she describes exactly what the schwa, the Achwa, always, and also the schwa, every morning they get up and they paint their faces. And they always do it. That not for tourists or anything. That's how they do it. And they paint the design that comes from their dreams of the night before, what they need to do during the day. So it may be an anaconda, it might be a butterfly, it might be a bird, whatever, jaguar, whatever. And I said, well, Lynn, you know, and I've been thinking about you in the Amazon and figuring you're the one who can respond to their call or help me respond to their call. And you've seen them, they're calling you. So within a few months, it was a number of months after that, she'd put together a group of 12 people that we took into the Amazon to meet with the Achwa. And they were so impressed on that trip that on the last morning, as we're about to leave Ecuador, they raised $120,000 amongst the 12. Well, it was actually fewer than 12 because one of them was my 12-year-old daughter, Jessica, who was with us, and me. So we're really like, and Daniel Cooperman, who's my partner in Ecuador. So I guess it was 9 of them. They raised $120,000, and that was the beginning of the Pachamama Alliance.
Yeah.
It's a good
and
story.
that story alone, I mean, just the role that consciousnesses can play, and it so challenges our materialistic orientation. Like, how can that possibly happen, right? Fortunately, we're here speaking with the Center for Contemporary Mysticism, so you know, people are open to that kind of possibility.
Yeah, and maybe another story that involves Lynn that happened before this. So I was on the board of directors of another nonprofit called Catalysis that worked with Mayan women, microcredit in Guatemala. And I was asked to take Lynn, I only just barely met her, and to spend 10 days taking her around Guatemala so she could meet with some of the women. She wasn't on our board. She was doing this as a favor to the board chairman, Bob Graham. But to meet with the Mayan women and find good hotels and places where we could bring some of our top supporters several months later, take them around to meet the women that they were supporting and stay in nice places that would be comfortable for them. And so Lynn and I are traveling around. And my job was to find a Mayan shaman who might help us and meet with our people. Well, the Civil War was still on. There was a 36-year Civil War when the Mayan were practically, the attempt of the government was to exterminate them, basically genocide, a kind of genocide. And the U.S. government was very much supporting the Guatemalan government in this because we were siding with the big agribusinesses and other companies in Guatemala that wanted to keep the price of labor low and continue to own huge amounts of land, companies like Chiquita. And so none of the shamans wanted to meet with us. They didn't want anything to do with Americans. But finally, one day, we get the message that this one shaman would meet with us, and we take this long trip through desolate country, and it was rather scary. Then I spent the trip in the back seat of this Land Rover, and there was a driver and a guard. It was also a translator, and he had a gun. It was crazy. Finally, we get to the shaman's house, and the shaman, whose name was Roberto Pose, was not nice at all to us. He was very cold, but they invited us in and sat down, and I explained to him what we want. We'd really like to make a connection with you, invite you to our board meeting. And he looks at me, and he's speaking Mayan, and it's being translated into Spanish, which is, I speak Spanish fluently, and then I'm translating into English for Lynn. I was going through this process. He looks at me and he says, like, your people have tried to destroy my people for centuries now, including right now with the Civil War. Why on earth would I ever want to meet with you, any of your people? And I said, well, that's why, because the people you'd be meeting with understand this, and we're trying to mend the ways, and we work with the Mayan women's co-ops, etc. He looks at me and says, that's the line that you always tell us. That's your seduction. That's your con. I have no desire to meet you here. Well, at this point, and he's being very aggressive and scary. We're in this little house way out in the middle of nowhere. Who knows what's going to happen next? And I describe this in the book, and some of the scary aspects. There's a couple of other people hovering around that were scary people. But then suddenly it just entered my mind. I had this bag with me. It's here someplace nearby, but it's from the high Andes. And inside this bag, I had come from Ecuador to meet Lynn in Guatemala. She comes from San Francisco. I'd come from Ecuador. I had this bag, and in this bag, I have, they're over there if I can't reach them, but these sacred stones that were given to me by shamans in Ecuador, the Tamayo family. And I had them in the bag. And I just, on intuition, the bag is there at my feet. I lifted it up, and I took out these incredible stones and laid them on the table. And Roberto Pose just looks at them and he says, where did you get these? And everything's changed. And now he's speaking fluent Spanish. And I said, well, they're given to me by the shamans in Ecuador, the Tamayos. He said, the Tamayos? I know the Tamayos. And I said, you've met them? He said, never physically, but I've journeyed to them. May I touch your stones? And I said, of course. And he puts his hands over them and he picks them up and he says, come with me. And he leads Lynn and me into this little room where his altar is, his mesa. And he puts the stones, my stones, down next to his, and he sprays some alcohol on them and does his ceremony with them. And everything changed. And then he did meet with our board, and he became very influential, and his daughter now continues to work with us. And it was just, it was just a remarkable experience that he knew the Tamayos from some shamanic journey that he'd done. And he totally, immediately, when he saw these stones, which are right over, I don't know, it'd be too much, but felt that. And it was so magical. And so that all happened before Lynn went to Africa and saw the faces, and it was with this shaman that a few days later that we'd done another ceremony. He agreed to do a ceremony with us, to come down out of his mountain retreat and do a ceremony, and so it was pretty impressive.
And that's when she first saw the faces, was in that ceremony in Jaguar.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Where she saw herself flying over a jungle.
Right.
Never been to the Amazon. She's never been any place in Latin America except Guatemala. And she's flying over the jungle on this shamanic journey with Roberto Pose. I'm beating a drum and he's guiding us. And she looks down and these faces emerge out of the jungle that's the first time she saw them. She actually saw Achua faces. And then a number of months later, she's in Africa where the Africans get the same signs on their faces.
Yeah, it was destined to be. So the Pachamama Alliance was founded, and when you talk in your book about touching the Jaguar, you talk about the perception bridge, and you talk about how we have our perceptions that create our reality. And then there's another reality that we might want to experience, but to do that, we have to change our perceptions. And on that bridge, there's a Jaguar that we have to touch. And it really, I was just considering how it is so often that it is our fears that prohibit us from changing our perceptions. And in this book, you're talking about the need to move towards the fears. And also you talk about the many times in your life when you have touched your own Jaguars time and time and time and time again. And so right now we are in this historical moment. We're all on this planet at this moment when we're confronting this environmental crisis, this historic inequality of wealth. What do you believe are some of the jaguars we in the developed world need to be touching in order to go over that perception bridge?
Yes. I think that, we each have our individual approaches to this, but the overall Jaguar is a fear of change. I think we all know that we need to change. I think everybody knows this, even executives that are making billions of dollars a year. They know that this in their hearts, they know this isn't really working. When I knew what I was doing was wrong as an economic hitman, I had a hard time convincing myself that what I knew was what I knew, because I didn't want to get out. I'm suddenly making a lot of money. I came from a poor family, a teacher's family in rural New Hampshire. And now suddenly I'm traveling around the world, flying first class, meeting with presidents, making a great salary. So I didn't want to admit that I knew that what I knew it was wrong. And I think there's we're in that situation now, most of us. We all know this. We all do things that we know we shouldn't be doing. We drive too much, we fly too much, we do whatever. We do too much, we have too big of houses, whatever. And so we fear change. That's the big fear. That's the Jaguar. That's this Jaguar. We fear change. Like, oh my gosh, if we're going to move to a life economy, which is an economic system that actually will pay people to clean up pollution, to come up with means to mine the plastic that's floating around in the oceans, to regenerate destroyed environments, to recycle, to create new technologies that don't ravage the earth. I mean, really, it's like, the Build Back Better idea of how do we, we can create a whole new economic system that can sustain life well, but it probably won't sustain 425 or however many billionaires we have in this country right now. But it still is it's a life system that'll sustain us better than we are being sustained today. That'll give us the opportunity to explore new ways of looking at what it means to be successful humans on this planet. Mm-hmm. That's where we're headed, and that's where we need to go. Will we get there? That nobody knows yet. I don't have a crystal ball, but that is where we need to go, and it's where we're headed. But we're afraid of change. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think that's almost a human quality of this fear of change, except I've seen with indigenous people that they often welcome change because they grow up knowing that everything's going to change. The river's going to change course. It's going to increase. It's going to decrease. And the seasons are going to change everything that we eat. We don't have any control over that. We don't try to have control over it. So I think we actually come from backgrounds, all of us, that welcome change. Mm-hmm. And I think, Patricia, one of the magical things about COVID, and I don't want to downplay the terrible seriousness, people who've lost loved ones, people who are very sick and so on, but there's a certain gift there that COVID has taught us, not only that sometimes we have to change, but that we can change. And we can even enjoy the change. I mean, I wonder how many of your listeners learned to play the flute or the violin, or wrote a book, or read a book, or did things that they wouldn't have done if it hadn't have been for COVID. And so we've learned that we can change, we must change, we can change, and we can even enjoy the change. It can be productive.
Yeah, I so appreciate what you're saying about people who really do live. And I guess the Pachamama Alliance, or I guess it's the Eco Lodge on their website, they talk about, Lynn Twist talks about how they are not in the forest, they are the forest, speaking of the Achuar, I believe, but people who inhabit that kind of reality where they know they are part of this web of life. And when you're in that kind of relationship with the natural world, there's no way you can't know that change happens, that everything is changing constantly. But we have our little ways of trying to, keep things fixed, and we've got our, our brick houses that are not going to, hopefully, fall over. But we try to push away change. One of the prophecies that you talk about is the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, which seems to be being fulfilled as we speak. And that prophecy talks about how long, long ago humans went down two different paths, the path of the mind, the intellect, and the path of the heart. Can you share a little bit about that prophecy and how you see it playing out right now?
Yeah, and it does. It goes back, they said, thousands of years. We don't know when it came out of the Amazon or the Andes as an oral tradition. But it basically defines the ego peoples as people who see themselves as apart from nature, basically as being supreme, human supremacy over nature. And the Condor peoples as seeing themselves as a part of nature. And the prophecy says that in what's called the fourth Pachacuti, Pachacuti is a 500-year interval, which would begin in our calendar around 1500. The ego peoples who saw themselves as apart from nature, high technology, high industry, and so forth, would practically destroy the Condor people, but not quite. And of course, we know that's what happened. 1492, Columbus. Yep. But the prophecy goes on to say 500 years later, in the fifth Pachacuti, around the year 2000, the opportunity would arise for the eagle and condor people to come together and to create a new consciousness. A consciousness that would actually help us return to realizing that we are a part of nature. We're not apart from. But we really have that belief system. You know, I mean, I happen to know how wise this young lady sitting next to me is. She has lessons to teach me every day. And, you know, I welcome them, but our tradition is, well, you know, just animals or just plants. The same with trees. I mean, trees, right now, you know, the plant world is speaking out so strongly. People are interested in ayahuasca, but we're also becoming vegetarians and vegans, and we're using herbal medicines more and more and more. People are really understanding the plants are speaking to us. They're totally speaking to us. Yeah. So we're getting back into that. So it is happening. So it was 1492, we saw this happen. And now in recent years, we've seen people take a much greater interest. They want to learn about shamanism. And the shamans have come out of hiding, where they were in hiding for 500 years. And they've come out to teach us. So we see that we are entering this new Pachacuti, this time of change of consciousness. But the prophecies all say, they don't say it will happen. They say there's a portal that's open, but we must pass through it. We must embrace it. And we must join forces, the eagle and condor, to create this new consciousness, which tells us that to feel that we are apart from nature defines us as aliens on our own planet. Mm. And now it's time for us to define ourselves as part of our planet, as being integrated with it, which means changing the perception of short-term maximization of materialistic consumption, which is destroying life as we know it.
Yeah. Well, John, I want to thank you again. I want to leave some time for our folks to ask questions if they would like. And again, I just thank you for taking time today. And I also can't thank you enough for all the work that you've been doing and how you have really been on the frontier of that portal, of that opening, of that opportunity for us to really open to that new and higher consciousness.
As you're talking, John, I saw somewhere in one of your talks you were saying, and I like this metaphor, that we're all on this spaceship Earth together, flying around, and there are no shuttles.
That's right.
I thought that was pretty powerful. You know, if we blow this one up, there's no shuttle to get us off. So it's powerful. And also, I think it's maybe providential, but before I let everybody go, I want to tell you about our next program coming up in 4 weeks on March 20th, and it's entitled Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. And we're going to have John Philip Newell, who's a world-renowned Celtic spirituality teacher and founder of the School of Earth and Soul, which was formerly a School of Celtic Consciousness. But he's going to be talking about his newest book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, Celtic Wisdom for Reawakening. And he's doing exactly what we're talking about. You know, could the wisdom of this ancient tradition of Celtic spirituality actually make us go deeper into our connection with God? And I think that is just profound. And I think I kept thinking about this as you're talking, because the next program on March 20th will be, a perfect follow-up to what you shared with us. So mark your calendar for March 20th. And thanks again to everyone who's participated, not only John and Patricia, but all our questioners and others who've sent in little notes on chat and other places. I think this has been just absolutely wonderful. So, John, I was going to ask what's next on your agenda. I know you said you mentioned a new book. Any new projects, trips? What's up?
Thanks, Joe. So I take people every year to indigenous people in the Amazon and in Colombia and in the Maya of Guatemala. And you can go to my website, johnperkins.org. Sign up. There's a little box where you can put in your email address and you'll get my newsletter. It's short and it's once a month, but at the end it also updates people. I haven't announced the dates of the trips coming up this next year yet, but we'll be announcing those soon. I'd love to have some of your people come with me to the Maya people of Guatemala, the Kogi of Colombia, wherever. Yes, everything will be on there.
That is great. Well, in addition to your website, I was going to mention that the Pachamama Alliance, that views its mission as a vision of environmentally sustainable, spiritually fulfilling, and socially just human presence on the planet, you might like to know more about them, and it's simply pachamama.org. So either that one or John's website, I think, would be very helpful in keeping up and following. So once again, folks, thank you. It's been such a joy to have you and everybody who's participated. So we'll say goodbye, and until we meet again, remember, stay safe, be well, and remember, you are perfect just exactly as you are. Namaste.